woman in California history to be elected to statewide office. So welcome to Betty Hughes.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for being here. Yeah, thank you. First of all, let me just say thank you to Bill for the invitation. And part of the reason I'd like to speak at Rotary Clubs, first of all, was because I really find tremendous value in the motto of our Rotary Clubs, and that is service above self. And I've been in public service for well over 35 years now, and I can actually say that even given everything we're reading about our government and everything, that there really is no higher honor than serving the people of the state of California. And I hope particularly some of the young people here think about your own service as you advance in your careers. So I also wanted to say, with respect to speaking about the state of the state, there's a lot happening, and Bill's final remark about my introduction, I may be the 10th woman ever elected to statewide constitutional office, but I don't intend to be the last, and I am not the last, thank goodness. So after the last statewide election in 2018, I'm now joined by Lieutenant Governor Lenny Kounalakis, as well as State Treasurer Fiona Ma, who I believe is a Pepperdine alum. So we're happy to now see more women serving in statewide office. What I thought I'd do today is just talk a little bit about the state of the state. We live in a big state. It's a complex state, but my background is in public finance and tax policy. And so as the controller, I serve as the independent financial watchdog over all of the state's finances. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that means in a moment. But every day, my team is keeping a very close eye on our revenues and our spending to look for really any bumps in the road that could dampen our economy. And so I guess you could say that what my team's always tasked to do is girding for that next downturn. And we're in this really historic period of unprecedented recovery from the Great Recession, well into the 10th year into our recovery, which prior to the Great Recession, we really could experience our cyclical downturns and then really count on a number of different sectors in the economy to essentially take us out of the slump. And today, because of our diversity of our economy, the global nature of our economy, it is quite different in terms of what's fueling our economy. And I will say that California, and why people look to California around the country and around the world, is that we were very responsible for the national recovery. We grew the economy by 3 million jobs. And the diversity of our economy, I think, has really been our strength. But I will also say that having traveled the state extensively and looking at the unique regions that make up California, it's really the diversity of our state that I think is our strength. It's the unique sectors that we have in each of the regions, the attributes of our population, the diversity that makes us really, I think, attractive globally relative to where we can do business. So we really live in a great, great place. So in terms of the economy and the outlook, I track revenues for the state of California. The budget is enacted. We're on a fiscal year cycle. And as of last month, our revenues came in above projections by over $2 billion from what was projected in the budget. So we're doing very, very well in terms of what I call the big three taxes that fuel our state general fund. And those are the personal income taxes, our corporation taxes, as well as our sales and use tax. And so all of them coming in above projection. So that's a good sign in terms of having enough to spend and to fund all of the programs that we're contemplating in the budget. We're seeing job growth also continue, but at a slower, but still at a steady pace. So that's probably the beginning signs of a downturn. There's been kind of prognoses back and forth about whether we're going to experience another recession or just a downturn. A lot of it is dependent on what's happening around the world as well, and glad to see there's some progress with respect to the tariff impasse with China, but our economy is very sensitive to the global environment, financial environment as well. Our unemployment rate is at a record low of 3.9%. It is quite something. The Anderson forecast at UCLA anticipates that our unemployment rate will probably tick up to about 5.1% by the fourth quarter of 2020, and a large part of that is due to slow national growth and also a weak housing market. And I'll talk about housing in a moment, but obviously a big factor here in California is our housing issue. So this is still half of our 5.1% is still less than half of our recession high era of 12.2% in 2010 with respect to unemployment. But this does put us on par back to the pre-recession unemployment numbers, and so really a great rebound. So as I said, the forecast stops short. The governor's forecast, when he puts a budget together, looks at the economic forecast, which then drives the revenue anticipated. And the forecast of the governor is that we are stopping short of predicting a recession, but we are long overdue for some level of economic downturn. And we're always getting these questions about when do we expect the next downturn to happen, and I would say that given this is a presidential election year, probably not before the election, and probably in the early part of 2021 is what we're all really contemplating at this point. Our cash position has improved significantly since 2009 due to increased revenues and also the voters' wisdom of creating a rainy day fund that functions as essentially a savings account. And that fund is expected to reach about $16.5 billion by the end of June. So we have historic high reserves in our annual budget. We've got the rainy day fund. We have a reserve set aside for public education, K-12 education, which is a formula-driven area of the budget. So as revenues increase and as we have growth, much more is dedicated to K-12 education. But when there is a downturn, we still have an obligation to meet that funding formula. So there was a K-12 reserve established for that purpose. There's also a reserve set aside for some of our social safety net programs. We know that when a downturn happens, there's more demand for those programs, and so there is also a reserve set aside for that. So we look at, I look at, from my perspective, paying the bills for the state of California. And by the way, because of the discipline of our former governor, Jerry Brown, and the legislature, we've not had to do any external borrowing to pay the bills for California. We've had enough with respect to all of our different funds to do internal borrowing between funds, all to be paid back within the same fiscal year, and so we've not had to do any external borrowing to pay the bills for California. We are certainly monitoring any global pressures that will threaten our economic progress, and we're really a nation state, and so we've got a GDP of nearly $3 trillion here in California, and any kind of global unrest can have a direct and pretty adverse impact on our state's economy, so something we're always watching for. Recent overseas conflicts, such as the the tension with Iran, also have obvious negative fiscal and social impacts as well. We talked about China, the trade and cybersecurity disputes with China, also a potential threat to our economy. The coronavirus down with just a lot of travel curtailed and a lot of business activity curtailed could also could be a contributing factor to a downturn as well. So we look at China with great interest. Obviously, Pacific Rim partner across the way. Trade in goods between the U.S. and China have increased from $4.8 billion in 1980 to now over $650 billion, and so it is a very, very important trading partner. More than half of the U.S.-China trade passes through the port of Los Angeles and Long Beach, and so very much economic driver of what happens in this region. Our imports, California imports more goods from China than any other state in the United States, and China ranks only behind Mexico and Canada as far as the final destination for California exports. So very, very important partner, as I said. Excuse me. The administration in Washington, I know, has imposed tariffs on other countries as well, besides China, Mexico, Canada, many European countries. And so while some of the tariffs have been lifted and others reduced, the administration's continued use of tariffs as a policy tool, I think, has the potential of creating long-term harmful effects to our diverse economy, right down to the small business here in Malibu. I mean, we have many small businesses that do business across the globe, and so I hope that we can get back to a more rational foreign policy where the harsh sanction of tariffs are only undertaken after all negotiations have failed, and so if that just gives us a little bit more certainty in terms of what can happen economically for California. But on a more immediate scale, as we all know, there are a few conversations happening in California, and I would probably be a safe bet to say, even among us here today, that doesn't include the topic of housing. Housing is really a crisis in California. As a native San Franciscan, I know all too well the limitations of housing in an area both known for its desirability, but also for its finite geography. And so I think Malibu certainly here faces similar circumstances. Our workers around the state are really hard pressed to find affordable housing in proximity to good paying jobs and also to good schools. The nonpartisan legislative analyst office says that we need to build about between 100,000 and 140,000 more units per year than we currently do, and mostly in coastal communities to catch up with the demand for affordable housing. And certainly housing market pressures are reflected in the growing homelessness population as well. So that is also the attendant crisis with respect to the housing affordability issue. As you're out in the community, you're probably seeing the effects of the housing crisis in our state, and though perhaps faring better than surrounding areas, right here in Malibu, we're not immune to homelessness and housing insecurity. The governor's budget last year included more than $1 billion to address homelessness, including $650 million in emergency aid for cities, counties, and regional homeless prevention agencies. This year in the budget that he proposed last month furthers the investments with a $750 million fund to develop and support affordable housing units. So it will take all these efforts and more to address California's long brewing housing crisis. And I would say we have probably close to over $13 billion in housing funding, bond funds, financing tools to really help make a dent in this area. And what's happened really, from my observation, I sit on the tax credit allocation committee that's chaired by the state treasurer, and in that regard, we award tax credits to developers as an incentive to build affordable housing. And what I've observed over the years is that we've had these really well-intended policies and programs and funding streams that have been layered really across one another, being administered by well over half a dozen agencies, and under the administration of many, many governors and many, many elected officials. And so it's become a very burdensome and duplicative bureaucracy that developers are having to deal with respect to state housing programs, to secure commitments from several state departments when we know that the time value of money is so critical in the construction field. So we need to do better in terms of how we administer these programs, and I am working with the governor now to look at streamlining all of the state's housing programs within a single agency and having essentially a one-stop shop. And to the extent that developers now, especially with the dissolution of redevelopment agencies several years ago by Governor Brown and the legislature, there is really no source of consistent hard capital for development projects, and so developers are having to really piece these deals together from any and all sources. So the state can do much better in terms of facilitating the developers' ability to access state programs. But I think what I want to also talk about is just, we live in this state where we have these diverse regions, and that's both, I think it's really our strongest attributes. When you look at how large and diverse California is, it is really the fact that we have, as I said earlier, these regions that have diverse economic sectors, diverse populations, and all adding to really the strength of this state. But I also know that as I reach out to business leaders in each of these regions, we see really a lot of unique concerns as it relates to these regions. And the reason why I want to talk about this is that Governor Newsom has essentially the theme of his administration is California for all, but also regions rising. That we need to pay attention not just to the coastal communities, not just to the large urban areas, but that there are a lot of other communities and regions that frankly we've ignored, but still have so much potential and promise with respect to being so additive to the strength of California. So you're going to see a lot more attention to the inland regions, the Inland Empire, the Central Valley, probably North State, Imperial County. I, for the life of me, don't know why we're not spending a little bit more time with respect to the communities around the border. That this is really, there's an ability to develop a lot more economic opportunities with the border communities. So we see, so as I've traveled the state extensively, certainly regional strategies differ with respect to economic development, but I can say that there's probably some pretty common themes in terms of what business leaders throughout the state expressed relative to their concerns, and that is high housing costs, number one, top of mind. For companies that want to grow and begin to think about expanding a workforce, where are our workers going to live? And for those who are trying to raise families, where can they afford to live and still be near schools? Business tax inequity is another concern. The idea that as policies are put in place with regard to tax policy, that they're really probably helping individuals and families more than they are trying to spur economic development. And I'll talk a little bit about tax reform in a moment that the governor is thinking about. Income disparity, we have growing inequality here in California, and that is another key issue for many business leaders. When the minimum wage increase legislation was going through, there were many parts of California business leaders who felt that $15 an hour was just too big of a leap to take. And yet we know that $15 an hour barely has anybody making it in California. But as a cost of doing business, when you're paying those wages, it is quite high for some communities in the Central Valley and the inland communities to be able to afford. So, but we do have growing income disparity. And then the other shared common concern is how we work better with government. That the accessibility of government, the ability of governments to understand the uniqueness of regions, how we look at essentially not enacting policies that are one size fits all, that really starts to reflect the unique attributes of the different areas of our state. So, so every region has a competitive advantage, and certainly share the challenges that I've just talked about. So when we've been looking at what we do about this, Governor Newsom has talked about wanting to do tax reform. I took a look at looking at tax reform in California during my first term as controller. And what I will say about the tax system in California is this. People ask me all the time, what keeps me up at night? And what keeps me up at night is not being able to pay the bills for the state of California. Not having enough money to do that. And it only takes really a mild downturn that will create huge swings in our revenue to the red, in terms of billions of dollars that we will not be receiving in revenues because of a downturn. And the reason for that is because much of our revenue system is heavily reliant on the personal income tax. And the personal income tax in California makes up close to, I believe it's probably like about 65% of our state general fund in terms of revenue. And more and more, those taxes are being derived from investment-related income, stock market-related income, capital gains, rather than wages from work. And so it's very volatile. So when we have a downturn, you can imagine that we're going to see just huge swings in terms of what's going to happen. We saw that for the first time in 2000 with the stock market crash. And so very volatile, very tough to think about how we do consistent budgeting with that. And really the only way to gird against that is to just build up reserves and be sure that we have rainy day funds when the economy does take a turn. So, but the other thing is when you look at tax reform, it is not just about looking at all these various proposals that have been on the table. I think there's one that's qualifying now that will assess commercial property differently from residential property, called the split roll property tax system. There have always been proposals in the legislature about expanding the sales tax to include the taxing of services rather than just goods. And so we're one of the few large states that does not tax services. So for example, if you're going to go get your car repaired, sales tax is applied on the parts but not on the labor. And so there's lots of revenue that could be generated from that, but we are one of a few large states that does not tax services. And then there's also talk about, continuing to talk about taxing corporations more, as well as those who are the upper income earners. And so you can talk about all those proposals, but at the end of the day, I think you have to question, what's the purpose of our tax system? And for me, it really is about having a system in place that could help spur and sustain economic development and economic growth. And when we look at it from that perspective, I think all of the things that I just mentioned could be barriers to economic development and economic growth if taken in isolation. And so when you look at the entire system, obviously we want a fair tax system. We don't want any particular community overburdened by it. We want to have certainty in our system. And so when Governor Newsom talks about doing tax reform, much easier said than done. But I hope that it can be an effort where we talk about, at the end of the day, how we bring better equity in terms of the regions that see such disparity, but also equity with respect to hopefully closing a little bit of the gap in terms of income inequality. But I want to just devote the rest of my talk to two topics that have really come to, I guess, influence everything that we do in the Controller's Office from a policy standpoint. And I probably should preface also that as your controller, yes, I pay the bills for California. Yes, I chair the Franchise Tax Board. It is tax filing season, by the way, so remember, April 15th. And I'll talk about some programs that are available for some of you in a moment. But it is also a policy position where I have a seat on about 70 different boards and commissions that influence public pension policy, tax policy, environmental policy on the State Lands Commission, as well as a number of financing authorities that are related to how we expend bond proceeds that have been approved by the voters. And so in this capacity, there have been two issues that have really surfaced as being, I think, thematic issues about where this economy is headed. One is really looking at how the nature of work itself is changing in California, how so much of our productivity now is driven by not human capital, but technological innovation, by artificial intelligence, robotics, AI, as I said, that just innovations that are really facilitating productivity in a much greater way than human capital. And then secondly, and no area's been spared by this, and particularly here in Malibu, we understand it, and that is the effects of climate change, of our planet warming. And so when you begin to look at those issues and seeing how widespread the impacts are, I begin to see that in California, unless we start addressing some of these issues, we probably are not going to have an economy that can be sustained, that can bring better equity, and that also can create opportunities for more and more Californians. So let me just talk about the future of work for a moment. We have, I have the great honor of serving on the Governor's Future of Work Commission, which is a 13-member commission that's been tasked to look at how we can establish a new social compact with workers in the 21st century. And what we mean by that is that what I've just talked about, that technology has had a particular influence with respect to what work looks like going forward. We have, and this is pretty, I think, astonishing. Over the last 40 years, we've seen productivity essentially just grow exponentially, but we've seen compensation really grow in the other direction. And also, when we look at the current workforce in California, about a third of our workers today in California make $15 or less an hour. And of that third, a good percentage of them have college degrees. So we know this is not sustainable from an equality standpoint going forward. And so when we look at a new social compact with workers, it's not about the things like healthcare or retirement or kind of what we talked about in terms of the social compact with workers back during FDR or Lyndon Johnson, but it's more about what does job quality look like going forward? How can we be sure that we are looking at, while we're looking at the attendant risks of technological innovation, that we also are looking at where the opportunities are. And so you're seeing the commission meetings are all public. We are meeting around the state. And what we hope to do is to come up with a set of recommendations after hearing from great thought leaders from throughout California about work, about the economy, about labor, about policy like tax policy, and then hearing from employers from California, from workers in California, and really start to fashion what a set of recommendations could look like that will talk about how California can be poised to continue to be an economic leader, but certainly a place where when we talk about work, that we are looking at how we embrace opportunities with technological innovation to create new opportunities, and I think we're going to have a good ability to do that. We don't look at addressing this, we're going to see just growing gaps with respect to issues of wealth, technological, we'll see inequities with respect to access to technology, and then also with respect to sustainability issues. And so, you know, of our low-wage workers, and this is really the demographic that when I think about doing this work on the commission, of our low-wage workers, 94% are over age 20. We have 57% that are Latinx, and 21%, this was the statistic, 21% have an associate or bachelor's degree. So it's not hard to see why our workforce is facing housing insecurity, wage issues, uncertainty about their opportunities in California. And by the way, last year, for the first time since we've been tracking this information, California lost more people to other states than we actually gained from other states and through natural birth. And so we're starting to see that migration out of California. So how are we gonna fix all this? Obviously, government doesn't have all the answers. This will require significant partnerships, public-private partnerships at all levels of government, across all types of disciplines, and I think really with a recognition that we have to do this together. For example, just in the area of housing, there are not enough public funds to build to the demand. And so we really do have to look at every opportunity to partner with the private sector. But I think really, when I think about kind of the three forms of capital that drives the economy and economic growth, our physical capital, obviously our infrastructure, a lot of it is still woefully inadequate and needing improvement. We see just the finite functionality with respect to our physical capital, which by the way also includes our natural resources, which are being depleted at a more accelerated rate. I think about our fiscal and financial capital, the fact that we are, I have the great honor of being a good steward of the state's taxpayers, but that our tax dollars, we can't keep going back to the taxpayers to ask them to pay more, and that with respect to our finances and fiscal resources, those will be finite also. When we look at how much we have to work with. But what we really haven't harnessed fully, in my mind, is our human capital. And that really coupled with technology and how we introduce technology to work, how we introduce technology to life, that we have just really a lot of great potential in terms of identifying new opportunities. So what I look at, just shift gears a little bit, but kind of bring it back all together. So really hand in hand, I think, the discussion with about the changing nature of work are discussions about climate change. So when I talk about these two issues, you can't talk about housing without talking about, excuse me, without talking about climate change. You can't talk about housing without talking about the future of work. And it's the same really with any other policy issue. When we talk about transportation policy, what are we really looking to do with our transportation systems if we're not recognizing the needs of Californians, but also how we're going to build smarter with respect to resiliency and sustainability. So across the dozens of boards and commissions on which I serve, climate clearly is becoming the overarching issue of concern. As the state's controller, I sit on the boards of both public pension funds, so the two largest in the nation, California Public Employees Retirement System, as well as the California State Teachers Retirement System. And through my work with those two funds, become deeply involved with the work of global institutional investors to look at how we can invest in sustainable ways and in ways that we are hoping that our business community across the globe are paying attention to the fact that climate risk is becoming more and more of a business risk and a financial risk. And so this work is being done on a global basis where we hope to be putting our pension assets and deriving better returns when we know that companies are paying attention to their ability to create long-term value and really embracing climate risk as something that has to be addressed not only within their companies but also throughout their supply chain. I currently chair the State Lands Commission, which is responsible for managing and protecting our public trust tidelands, our submerged lands, our desert lands, and many of our navigable waterways along the Pacific coast. So our reach spans from the Klamath River up in the north to the Tijuana estuary down south, and we go as far east as Lake Tahoe and the Colorado River. But there are public lands here that really are being governed by the public trust doctrine, where access issues are continue to be a growing concern for the Commission. The ports and harbor districts are critical to our economic strength. They are our trustees over our tidelands and submerged lands. But I talk about this because on the State Lands Commission, we are dealing with the very real issue of sea level rise. This is going to have impacts with respect to the ports operations, as well as to security. I mean, national security and sea level rise have a very, very strong nexus. And we also know that with sea level rise that we are looking at many of the businesses that really depend on our oceans and our waterways may be compromised as well, and certainly property owners here in California in our coastal communities. So we have here in California just a huge focus on what we're going to do relative to climate. And as chair of the State Lands Commission, I also serve on the Ocean Protection Council, which is going to be taking the lead on developing a climate resiliency bond that the governor just proposed. We also are very thankful to the governor for creating a revolving loan fund for climate technology, and then also looking at hopefully the state as a general matter, just embracing more and more sustainability with respect to the practices of how we run the state department by department. So we're very happy to see the focus on all of that. But the reason I want to talk about these two things is this. From a fiscal perspective, if we don't get out ahead of any of these issues as relates to climate, as relates to the future of work, California will fall behind. And our inequality will continue to grow. From a budgeting standpoint, in terms of dealing with climate now, or when we actually see sea level rise, what we can do now is certainly much better, but it's a difficult situation where we have to talk about how to fund both short-term needs as well as long-term needs that are still yet to be determined. And so, but if we wait until the time that we're going to have to deal with the emergent long-term needs, it will essentially crowd out every other area of the budget to really address those issues. So it really does matter. But I want to end with three things and then talk about a couple of state programs. So kind of how do you put all of these together? So when I look at the economy, there definitely is a future for climate-related businesses and climate-related sectors. Obviously, California is leading the green sector, the renewable sector, relative to energy. We will continue to grow that. Still a lot more to go with respect to how we look at how we develop those energy sources. There will be much more demand placed on our lands and on our oceans as we look at our needs going forward. We will see much heightened interest in terms of wind energy as a source of energy, wave energy to the extent that we have sea level rise. How do we capture that tidal activity that could also potentially generate energy as well? So a lot of interest in that. When we look at climate change, we also need to think about our state lands and what we do with agriculture, our working lands, and what that means in terms of long-term viability of those lands. There's now lots of interest globally to look at using ag lands and our working lands to be really sources of how we keep carbon in the ground, sequestration and carbon capture. And so those are, again, proposals that we will be looking at over the next period of years as well. But we also have, in terms of climate, just the ability to look at from a very, very personal standpoint. And I remember Governor Brown always saying this. He was our climate champion when he was in office globally. And he would always say, Betty, I don't know that we can really move the needle on this until we start talking about this at our dinner tables. Because we really haven't faced the reality of what's happening to us. We still have food on our table, we still have access to water, but the fact is our food supplies could be compromised, and access to safe drinking water or quality water or just water for industrial purposes could be severely compromised if we don't look at how we develop the technology for sustainability, how we bring in more policies that speak to how we keep our cities and our communities resilient. And so this is really the work that we're working on going forward. But it's also going to, I think, create a new need for entrepreneurship. That even though the technologies will get developed, we need entrepreneurs to actually help us bring it into communities. And so I just see a lot of promise with respect to what can happen there. There are three sectors that I've been particularly focused on in my work on the Future of Work Commission. And it really speaks to, I think, needs that we have for hopefully closing that inequality gap. We've been talking a lot about the care industry in California. We have an aging population in California where we are ill-prepared to really deal with the needs of our older adult population in California. The good news is that older adults are living longer, they're healthier as they age, and so, but the preference is that many want to age in place and stay in their own homes as they get older. And so I don't believe we've even harnessed that one fact alone, that we could build industries around that one particular area where we can talk about an industry that's is focused on home modification. We can talk about an industry that looks at developing a caregiving market that is not heavily reliant and really the fallback on family caregivers, and that takes both a emotional and a financial toll on families. And so this is the work that we will continue to discuss, but I think having a particular focus on the care sector is very, very important. There's a cost to family care that is uncompensated that we are going to try to place a value on to make the case that we really should be thinking about developing a broader caregiving market, not just for our older adult population, but for anyone with disabilities or anyone that's requiring care in the community. Secondly, The retail sector, as we know, looks very, very different now. Much of our retail business is transacted online, and so many workers are being displaced from the retail industry, and we are going to need to talk about, I think, what those opportunities are with respect to the retail sector of our economy. Already, many who are in particularly the grocery business, many of those companies are already rethinking about what their business models will look like. You're seeing a lot more of the, the DoorDash and the delivery types of companies, but I will say that, many of those business models I don't believe are sustainable. And so, I don't know, some of the discussions that have been taking place have been around, our grocery stores becoming more like nutritional centers and serving a bigger need than just selling food, but really creating more of a service center as it relates to all of things around food. And we also see that our retail malls are less and less populated by stores. More and more of that is going to be devoted to experiential types of venues. So whether it's sports or entertainment, restaurants, this is going to be an area where we have major company. Westfield has a huge footprint in California. What are we going to do with all of that mall space? And so I know there are discussions underway with local governments to try to have more community beneficial services at the mall site, and hopefully we can see some innovative strategies there as well. And then the last sector is really the hospitality sector. There are many, many parts of California that are having a hard time hiring people to wait tables at restaurants. And it's because there are not the workers who live close by to those establishments. In Silicon Valley up north, I know that many can be in the tech sector and make much more than what they would make in a restaurant. And so this is becoming a growing issue with employers about where to hire the help that they need to run a restaurant. So the hospitality industry, how workers are compensated, how we characterize tips that are earned as part of wages or not, and so just a lot of issues kind of wrapped up in that as well. So I'll conclude by saying this. As we engage in these conversations, certainly with the Commission, we want to be sure that everybody has a voice in this, because this is really, I think, important, particularly for young